So yeah, this sort of cold open mission was really meant to set up the Mr. Negative character and the rest of the game. He's a tough enemy, isn't he, Wyatt?
Yeah, Wyatt just went down.
Yeah.
Hi, I'm Michael, and welcome to Story Mode, the channel where we explore the storytelling power of video games. Today we are talking about the opening of Marvel's Spider-Man, the 2018 game developed by Insomniac Games. I'm joined by part of the Story Mode team, Brian Bittner.
Hello, hello.
And on the controller is Wyatt Strain.
Hi.
And we're excited to have Jon Paquette here with us today. Jon is the narrative director at Insomniac Games and was the story lead on Spider-Man as well as Miles Morales. Jon, thank you for joining us.
It's great to be here. Good to see y'all.
Yeah. So before we get started, if you want to see us play through the finale of Spider-Man, we also did that with Jon, and we discussed some of the unique challenges that come with writing for a video game. So check out that video, just click the link that pops up in the top of the screen or head to the link in the description below. But so the opening of Spider-Man, so this game is super fun and I love it. I was thinking about actually how I first heard about it, and I happened to get coffee with a fellow YouTuber, Charlie McDonnell, and he was, amongst other things, saying like, oh, by the way, have you played the new Spider-Man game? It's super fun, but it's also one of the best Spider-Man stories I've ever played. You gotta
Really?
check
That's
it out.
cool.
Yeah. And I was like, okay, that's a high praise. And so I went and I played it, and he was absolutely right. It's so great, and it's cool because it's a new Spider-Man. You know, it's not the Peter Parker from the MCU films. It's not a Peter Parker from Spider-Verse. You guys got to create a new Peter Parker story. So I'm excited to talk with you about all of that and what went into it and the challenges and all that stuff. So as we start the game here, I'm thinking, why don't you just start with like this first shot? What did you want to signal to players about what they were about to get into?
Right. Well, I mean, what we started with was the discussion of, hey, what kind of Spider-Man do we want to have, right? And pretty early on, we decided we didn't want to do another origin story. We felt like Spider-Man is a pretty well-known character. We've seen that story a lot. Mm-hmm. So we wanted to start with Spider-Man after he's been Spider-Man for about 8 years, right? So with this opening shot, which for anyone who's seen Back to the Future, you know what this does. We just wanted to get a lot of exposition across very quickly. You know, one of the old writing rules is show, don't tell. So we're showing a lot here. I don't know if you noticed that his laptop fund was empty. Or no, sorry, his vacation fund was empty, but his laptop fund had a few coins in it. So that kind of shows you his priorities there.
Right.
But you know, this is a Peter Parker who you know, he's got a lot going on. He's been doing this for a while. And in this first scene here, he hears about Wilson Fisk potentially about to leave town. And so he wants to make sure that he gets him before he does.
Yeah, and I also love that it starts off with like a character choice happening of like, you know, he's on his way out, and then a notice comes that's like, you're going to be evicted, and you see him have this moment of like, do I choose Spider-Man or do I choose Peter Parker right now? And like starting that off with that choice just gives such a great signal of who this character is.
And you know, it's super important. You know, that's one of the things that we learned early on. Bill Roseman, who works at Marvel, he told us right from the get-go that the best Spider-Man stories are when Peter's world and Spider-Man's world collide. Anytime you can get those two worlds to come together is great. But the other thing that I like about the opening is that we start with Peter, right? Like everybody's fantasy is to be Spider-Man, to have the superhero abilities and do all the cool stuff. But we show him asleep in bed, just like us, right? We show him get woken up and you know, he's got to put on his old suit, which stinks. So he sweats and he's got to do laundry just like us. And he's got to eat, right? Just like us. And I think that's something that we we recognized as we were making this story is that the more we can make Peter like us, I think the more connected our audience and players will be to Spider-Man, right?
And I think that also helps for old people like me who are like, their Spider-Man traditionally is like the high school guy, right? So, but then it's like, this is a guy who had, like you said, he's been doing this for a while. He and Mary Jane have had a relationship, no longer do, and that just makes it interesting, and it makes it feel a little more a little, I don't know if grounded's the right word, but just a little more maybe universal to a wider variety of players.
Yeah, and me and Brian Intihar, the creative director, we talked a lot early on about what we were like when we were that age, when we had just finished college and we had all these plans for how we wanted to have great careers and how the world hadn't slapped us in the face yet, right? So there's still a lot of that sort of giddiness that Peter has, but it's not the naivete, I guess, that young Peter typically has in high school, right?
Right.
He's a little bit more experienced.
Yeah, I remember being just really struck by that immediately of like, oh, like an older Spider-Man is something that I have not seen before, and like you're saying, Brandon, I was able to like connect with in a more interesting, not a more interesting way, but just in a different way as a more of an adult person.
Were there any specific like comics or anything that you drew from for this for that version of Peter, or was it mostly just internal?
Well, here's what we actually did. We tried to read as much as we could. We tried to watch as much as we could, and we tried to like devour anything Spider-Man, right? So that we could become experts in what a good Spider-Man story is. And then we tried to forget all that because our
Right.
goal, and it was great because Marvel said, hey, we want Insomniac's version of Spider-Man, right? So we didn't want to be too inspired by any of the great stories that had come before. So our goal was to really get a sense for, okay, what are the key ingredients to making a good Spider-Man experience, a good Spider-Man story. So we tried to distill that down from reading all those comics and watching the movies and the TV shows and every like I said, everything Spider-Man. And we got down to there's I don't know, probably about 5 or so key ingredients. And the first one is what I was saying earlier, which is that there's always a conflict between Peter and Spider-Man, right? And actually the same holds true for Miles, right? When Peter and like you said, Michael, we opened the game with that choice that he had to make. Okay, if I don't pay my bills, I'm probably going to get evicted. But Wilson Fisk is about to escape. I got to hurry up and go get him. Which one am I going to choose, right? And it wasn't until working on the game for a while that we recognized that there's kind of a rule that happens whenever a dilemma comes up for Spider-Man is if Spider-Man's going to win something, Peter has to lose. And if Peter's going to win at something, then Spider-Man's got to lose. Some sacrifice has to take place there for the other character. And I think that makes Spider-Man a really compelling character for a lot of us. So that was kind of like the number one rule. They're constantly at odds, those two identities. Another one was something that Bill Roseman said early on, which is a theme in a lot of great Spider-Man stories, which is science gone wrong. So in this game, we spend a lot of time in Otto Octavius's lab. We spend a lot of time actually with Norman Osborn learning about Devil's Breath and genetics, and spoilers for those of you who haven't gotten too far in the game. But that sort of theme and that world of being a scientist is something that's core to Peter's identity, and he's sort of a geek about it, but in a great way. So we had to become geeks about it too. Like We hired some scientific experts to come in and help us learn about brain-machine interfaces and advanced prosthetics. We definitely did our research and made sure that all the science in the game was authentic, and it made sense in the real world. So yeah, science gone wrong is another big one. Something you'll see here as he's fighting a lot of these enemies here. He's always got these quips, right? Spider-Man is very quippy, talky, sometimes too much. But it's a core part of who he is. And the way that I took that is that he uses humor as a defense mechanism, right? Like that's what happens when he gets nervous, stressed. He likes to make a joke. And I think there's actually a scene a little bit later on in the game where something goes wrong with Doc Ock, with Otto. One of the experiments goes wrong, and Otto gets really angry, and he like throws something and curses Norman, and Pete makes a joke, and Otto like turns and gives him a look, and he's like, I have a habit of making jokes in tense situations, right?
Right.
And I think it's something that makes him endearing as a character, at least to me, because I think I'm a little bit like that as well. For anybody who knows me, I try not to get too serious in what we do. That's a big one. I'm trying to think what the other ones are.
I just also like that gives the comedy and the quips a narrative purpose, a narrative function too, right? Rather than just being like, we got to make it funny. It's like, no, the character's actually doing that for a reason, and that's
exactly.
Yeah.
And the thing with the quips, I mean, it's really hard, especially in situations like this when you're in combat, because the player can play at whatever pace they need to, right? And it really can get annoying pretty quickly if he's making too many jokes, right? So one of the things we recognize that the jokes that tend to work best are the ones that are situational, right? So he's not just quipping for the sense of throwing out a quip, right? He's commenting on something that is happening to the player at that moment, so that the player is immersed in the experience with them, or with Pete, and they can get the sense of the joke at the same time.
It's so great because it, like you're saying, it brings the Spider-Man-ness of the story into the gameplay also. Like, it's not just we're watching Spider-Man and Pete be them in the cutscenes. It's while you're fighting, while you're controlling Spider-Man and doing all these cool dodges that make you feel like you have Spidey sense and all that stuff. The comedy is there too, and so just the tonal range that the story covers is great, and I love that you feel that in the combat also, not just in the cinematics or whatever.
Yeah, that's a great phrase you just used, tonal range, because it's something we learned from the MCU movies, is the way that they'll have these fantastic sequences full of action, full of drama, but then they'll work hard to make sure that one Robert Downey Jr. line happens at the right time to sort of deflate the tension, get the audience back on track with the characters, and so we tried to take a cue from the Marvel movies with pacing of the humor and the drama, and make sure that we don't make you tired. It's easy to get tired, especially in an action game when there's so much going on. We want to make sure that we have these peaks and valleys of action, drama, and a little bit of downtime. And so we kind of used Otto's lab for that, as a way for the player to kind of take stock and walk around as Peter for a while. That was another big aspect of bringing this to a video game, that was frankly a little challenging and scary, is that we wanted to make sure that you had time as Pete, where you're not doing all the gameplay, right? And anytime you say that to any game designer, or even any game writer, game maker, they're they're going to be like, yeah, but what are you doing when you're walking around as Pete? And so that we did a lot of early prototypes and talked a lot about what the player could be doing as Pete. And I'm really proud of the work that the team did to make Otto's lab and the Feast Center feel like areas where the player could go and get a sense of what it's like to be Peter Parker, not just Spider-Man.
Right. And even the mini games and stuff being, science and photography and things like that, or just like talking with MJ on the phone while he's web swinging from place to place. Like you're always remembering that this is Peter Parker and not just this like masked video game character running around fighting people. Yeah.
Yep. Yeah, because when you know who the person is under the mask, it adds meaning to every punch and kick that you throw. And that's what we want to do. We want to make sure that this person that you're controlling, you really feel like Spider-Man, and that's hard. I mean, it takes a lot of iteration, frankly.
Yeah. Well, and so what's really cool is how you're mentioning Doc Ock's lab, and we'll try to not spoil too much, but there are these kind of like different locations that kind of set up these different subplots almost that are going through the story, and it is nice to be able to go from crime fighting in the streets to spending time with this character in this location or that character in that location. And without spoiling too much, it's great how eventually all these threads like come together. But yeah, I'm curious for you guys, like how did you kind of arrive at what the right balance was of those different subplots, or which characters are going to be included, because there's so many characters to draw from. Some we're familiar with, some we're not. So what was that kind of decision making process like?
Well, we did a lot of meetings, and we talked about a lot of different storylines. I'll give a lot of credit to Christos Gage and Ben Arfman, the other two writers on the project. We wrote a lot of stuff that never made it into the game, but I think the way that we arrived at the final product, if you will, is just by trying a lot of things out, seeing what worked, seeing what didn't work. There's one mission where Ben wrote this one mission that I think he must have rewritten it like probably 10, 15 times, just because the game mechanics kept changing, right? And that's to be expected. Like that's how you make a great game, is you put something in there, you try it. If it doesn't work, you try it again. And Ben did an amazing job of eventually finding the right thematic tone to hit that mission with, we just kind of did that for every mission throughout the game. We built the mission, we played it, we made changes, we rewrote it, it's kind of like when on a film you get to a rough cut, and then you realize that we've got all this stuff in here. Some of this stuff works really well. Some of this stuff over here doesn't work as well. I feels like we're missing some stuff. How do we kind of put all this together into a more cohesive package? That's what alpha is like on most games. Like when you get to alpha, if you're not familiar with game terminology, like alpha is like, at least at Insomniac, it's like code and content complete, right? Like everything is that we're gonna make is in the game. There might be a lot of bugs in there. It might not be completely polished, but you can play through the game from beginning to end and get a sense for how things are. Similar to a rough cut in a film. And so that's when films oftentimes go in for reshoots, right? Rewrites. And I think Marvel Studios, they actually schedule in reshoots and rewrites for every film that they do, because they know that this is going to happen when you have these stories with so many characters and so many arcs to keep track of, that sometimes you're just going to end up with things that, I don't know, don't fit in the end.
Right. Yeah, any kind of creation process is an iterative process, and being able to have that time and put resources into revision is so important. I wish more movies did that, because clearly it pays off.
That's also the difference between movies and games. Where movies, you have to schedule a reshoot. Like if you didn't get the shot, you have to go get the shot. In games, you can, obviously it varies, but you can just go in and change the coding or change the, whatever. So you get a little more leeway there.
Yeah, there's a little more leeway, but we're learning. I mean, games as an art form is still pretty young. We're learning how much time to give ourselves at the end to make sure that we have enough time to go in and make the changes that we need to. We haven't always been successful in planning that time, and I think what we did on this game, depending on who you ask, felt like we could have used a little bit more time, but it felt like we were able to do a lot of the big things that we wanted to do when we saw the game at Alpha, and we felt like it came together pretty well.
Yeah, no, absolutely.
Yeah.
Well, and so another big part of like what a Spider-Man story is, at least the way I think about it, is Peter's home, like New York City, like the place is such a big part of the character. And as we saw at the beginning, there's that brief cinematic, but then Peter jumps out the window and you do a couple swings, and then the player has control. And I remember that being like, oh, we're just going for it. Okay, game, like that's pretty cool. That just like it blends that smoothly, and now it's like, here is New York, like go forth. So yeah, how much of the design of the city, played a part in how it connects to the narrative, and how did you guys kind of conceptualize all of that?
Well, I think you're right that it is a big part of the experience, and it's a big part of the fantasy too, right? Like when you think Spider-Man, you think New York, and then most of us, when we think about, oh, what would I do if I was Spider-Man, like one of the first images that comes into our heads is swinging between skyscrapers in Manhattan, right? Like that's what we think of, and that's what we think a Spider-Man experience should be. So we wanted to go a little bit further than that, because we're going to be spending so much time in the city in this game. I said early on, it's got to be its own character, right? Like it's got to be a character that has an arc throughout the course of the game. So just like any character, it's got to have a visual and sort of thematic change from beginning to the end of it. So we actually structured the narrative so that the city underwent like 3 big kind of changes visually and gameplay wise, so that when you're swinging through the city, it looks and feels and sounds different than it did earlier in the game or later in the game. And that was something that it was really hard to do, because essentially you're taking all this work that our tremendously talented art team does to create the city, and we're having to pile more work on top of it to make different versions of it, so that it looks and feels different throughout the game.
But it's awesome. It's like so effective.
It's also such a, most open world games are learning that lesson now, but 10 plus years ago it was like, oh, the world's ending, you got to get to the other side of town. It's like, okay, and you go out and everything's exactly the same as it was at the beginning of the game, and it doesn't feel like the world's ending until you get to the next checkpoint, and then suddenly it's like nighttime and it's thunder. You're like, wait a minute, but it wasn't,
Yeah.
So it's always nice when the open world feels like cohesive to the rest of the story.
Well, yeah, and we wanted to make sure that, especially here at the beginning, that we had some time to relax and see the city at peace, right? Because we know we want the story to escalate. We want there to be higher stakes near the end of the story, but we also want the player to be able to feel what it's like to be Spider-Man in a peaceful Manhattan for a little while.
Sure.
And it's funny, like after we released the game, I remember hearing from some fans how they didn't really even care much about the story. They just kind of wanted to swing through the streets, and that was like when, after they had a long, hard day at work, they would come home and just swing around Manhattan, and it would be nice and relaxing. A lot of props to our animation and engineering team, who made swinging just feel so good. And that's not an easy thing to do. But they worked really hard through iteration to make that happen.
I feel like this is one of the the few games where, like, even though fast travel like can be an option, I would always be like, oh, I have to get to the other side of the city. That's fine. I will swing the entire way over and have fun the whole trip.
That's good because we throw in a lot of exposition on that swing. So if you fast traveled, you might miss out on some context, and you might get to where you're going and be like, wait, what am I doing here again?
It's not the problem other games have where if you're on the ground level, you got to like get up to a building and then you can have fun. It's like you're just able to swing from everywhere and run up buildings, so it always feels just satisfying.
Yeah, and he moves really fast too, like out in the city. So there were a lot of times when we had to rewrite conversations because the player would be able to get to the start of the next mission really quickly, and we'd have to just throw out whole conversations and just like bam, 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 quick, get to the point, so that the player knew what was happening.
Right. I wanted to ask, since we're at Fisk now, what the choice was to have him as the first sort of big bad villain. Because I think the casual fans would know him more from Daredevil, or not at all, possibly. So I was wondering.
Yeah, well, that really started out because we wanted to introduce a new villain, Martin Lee, Mr. Negative, that not a lot of fans had heard of. But in order to kind of set the stage for that, what we wanted to do was we wanted to have the first mission be, okay, Spider-Man takes down his longtime nemesis, and now there's a power vacuum in the city, right? And that's something where a young upcoming criminal can fill that power vacuum, and it gives Martin Lee an opportunity to get a foothold in the city, and his inner demons to kind of become the main villain and faction that you fight throughout most of the game. So yeah, this sort of cold open mission, it was really meant to set up the Mr. Negative character and the rest of the game. He's a tough enemy, isn't he, Wyatt?
Yeah, Wyatt just went down.
Yeah.
Wyatt, explain yourself.
And credits.
You know, it's a good
great
way to introduce people to the potential difficulty.
Yeah. But yeah, and so we had a lot of fun on this mission. Travis Willingham plays Wilson Fisk. He's great at voice actor, and Yuri Lowenthal, of course, being Spider-Man. You know, the working with great actors, both on the performance capture set and in the VO booth. Man, they make everything so much better. You know, I think that's something that folks who aren't as familiar with making games might not appreciate as much, is how the talents of the voice actors and the whatever magic they have when they bring that to the character, it makes it come alive so much more. And it's a skill too. Like not all actors have the skill to sit in a booth and make you feel like that character is present. And Yuri is one of the best. As a matter of fact, we would often write lines and just say, Yuri, make something up. and he would like make something up in the booth, and
that's awesome.
And it would be better than what we had written. So it's a real privilege to be able to have worked with him on this game.
I think it's one of those thankless things where you notice when it doesn't sound right, but you don't notice when it does sound right, because it just sounds so flawless and seamless that you're just like, oh, this voice just existed always. It just showed up when the game showed up.
Yeah, and it's funny how, you know, we will often like just jump into a VO session with Yuri, and it'll be so easy, and we'll just kind of look at each other and be like, how does he do that? Like, it makes everything, you know, he makes it look easy, and it's not, right?
Right. Well, yeah, and there's so many things that kind of elevate the narrative, but I feel like the performances do, you know, help this story stand like on equal footing next to the other Spider-Man stories in terms of just like production quality, even, because it's, you know, a bad performance from a Peter, you know, even if it's a video game, that's gonna feel different, but it has the dramatic weight of any Spider-Man story, and obviously a lot of that is because of the performances.
Yeah, and a lot of credit goes to Chris Zimmerman, our voice director, and to Bobby Coddington, our animation director. They worked really hard with the actors on stage and on set to, really get the great performances out of them. And if you talk to the actors, they have a great time playing these characters. It's fun to be Spider-Man and villains and so on and so forth.
Right. I'm sure. I was really worried for you there for a moment by us. Did you do it?
Not holding any punches.
I think, like, the other thing that's great about Fisk is, like you were saying, he's positioned as Spider-Man's, like, big nemesis that he's been going after this whole time. And so to start off the story with him getting captured also reinforces what you were saying earlier about this is a new Spider-Man that's been doing it for so long. So rather than, introducing a new person that's going to be the main antagonist this whole time, we're going to start off with capturing the main antagonist, and it creates that, the satisfaction of you've just completed something as Spider-Man, but it also then, for me as a player, left me with lots of questions about the narrative of like, okay, well then, where are we going here? And so in the best possible way. So I feel like it just dovetails so nicely with all the other things you set up of like, this is a familiar Spider-Man at an unfamiliar age. So you have your bearings, but you also don't know what's going to happen next.
Yeah, and that goes back to what I was saying earlier about how we wanted to capture this moment at people's lives when they're just out of college and they feel like they can take on the world. They haven't been slapped in the face by life yet. And right now, at this moment where Pete's sitting on that perch, he's just taken down Fisk. He's like, I think I got this life covered. Like, all my big nemeses are behind bars. I've got this job with Dr. Octavius that, oh shit, I'm late for, but gosh, it's going to be a great thing that I can do to change the world as Pete, right? And he's got so much enthusiasm about this next chapter in his life, and I think that's a great that we tried to start off the story with like a surge of positive energy in his life, and then of course it just goes downhill from there.
Right.
But I also think that helps, that sort of feeling of like it's relaxing to just swing around Manhattan. You give the player permission to say, like, not everything, the world is not always ending. Sometimes you can just kind of hang out for a bit and go do some tasks, and that feels very comforting and satisfying to do. And then you're ready when the next big thing happens.
Mm-hmm. Right.
Yeah.
And then, like we were talking about, it sets up the tonal range that the story will explore, where you get to start with this like lighthearted, you get to be happy Spider-Man, and as you said, things change from there.
Yeah, well, and going back to the DNA of a great Spider-Man story, tragedy is also one of those big pieces. He does use humor as a defense mechanism, but he's also, at least in the best stories, he's confronted by tragedy. Where he's got to make these heart-wrenching choices. And we recognized that early on, and we wanted to make sure that was a part of our narrative.
Yeah. Well, yeah, speaking of heart-wrenching choices...
Stay tuned.
Yeah, I think we should go talk about the finale of Spider-Man. But yeah, thank you, Jon, so much for joining us. Again, viewer, if you want to hear the rest of our conversation and see us play through the dramatic ending of Spider-Man, click the link in the description. Jon, thank you so much for your time. Thanks for joining us. And we will see you in the next video.
Let's do it.